The only person that should be worried is Nicolas Maduro, who's running effectively as a kingpin of a narco state.
The world was stunned when Pete Hegseth confirmed that Venezuelan President Maduro is now in custody. After years of smuggling drugs into the US, authorities finally found a way to take him down. But that's nothing compared to the brutal action they're planning to take against him: the capture. For years, Maduro has laughed off sanctions, mocked US indictments, and defiantly told Washington that Venezuela will never be enslaved.
Y aquí no lograrán ni colonizar, ni esclavizar, ni a Venezuela, ni a América del Sur, ni a nuestra América.
His speeches always carried a mix of bravado and desperation, as if he knew deep down that the world was closing in. But even Maduro's critics could hardly imagine a scene where he would be in US custody, awaiting extradition, staring down the kind of charges that end political careers and end lives in prison cells. And here's the twist: this wasn't some overnight success, some spur-of-the-moment capture. This was the result of years of planning, years of military buildup, and years of drug war strategy finally converging. Pete Hegseth himself made it clear in past interviews that Maduro was living on borrowed time.
The only person that should be worried is Nicolas Maduro, who's running effectively as a kingpin of a narco state, not actually elected, and indicted for $50 million by the United States.
That bounty wasn't symbolic. It was an open declaration. America wanted Maduro, dead or alive, preferably alive, but willing to take whatever fate delivered. And now, after cartel boats were blown out of Caribbean waters, after Trump authorized lethal strikes that left cartel operatives in pieces at sea, the dominoes finally fell. Maduro wasn't captured in a palace raid or a midnight ambush inside Caracas. He was cornered by the very system he created. The networks of corruption, drug trafficking, and false promises that once shielded him eventually became the trap that swallowed him whole. When the US military, under Hegseth's guidance, began systematically dismantling cartel routes across the Caribbean, the narco state Maduro relied on began to collapse. Cartel bosses no longer trusted his word. Allies in the underworld stopped answering his calls. The man who once ruled Venezuela like a kingpin became a fugitive in his own country. And when the net tightened, it was Trump who gave the order. He had warned repeatedly that cartel boats would be taken out. No warnings, no second chances.
We just, over the last few minutes, literally shot out a boat, a drug-carrying boat, a lot of drugs in that boat.
He told the American people plainly that Venezuela was not just misbehaving diplomatically, but actively sending poison into the veins of the United States.
We have Venezuela acting up in a different way. They continue to send people that we rebuff to our border. They continue to send drugs into our country.
This was never just about politics. This was about survival. The survival of American communities ravaged by fentanyl, meth, and cocaine pouring from Venezuela's shores. And Trump, unlike previous administrations, didn't want to sit back and wring his hands. He wanted a fight. Pete Hegseth echoed that same sense of urgency when he described the strike on cartel operatives.
And so those 11 drug traffickers are no longer with us, sending a very clear signal that this is an activity the United States is not going to tolerate in our hemisphere.
The message was clear. Maduro's time as the cartel's king was ending, and America wasn't going to wait for him to surrender voluntarily. But let's rewind for a moment, because to understand why this capture is earth-shattering, you have to understand who Maduro became. On paper, he was a president. In practice, he was a mob boss, a dictator whose power didn't come from the ballot box, but from cocaine shipments, illegal mining profits, and alliances with groups like Tren de Aragua, a cartel so notorious it has been designated as a terrorist organization by the United States. Elections in Venezuela, a sham. The evidence of fraud has been laid out publicly, with opposition leaders barred from running. Millions of Venezuelan expatriates denied a vote, and results flipped in the dead of night. Independent tallies showed Maduro losing with barely 30% support, while the opposition carried 2/3 of the vote. Yet he declared himself the winner with 51%, a number as fabricated as the loyalty he claimed to command. So what happens when a dictator loses legitimacy at home, earns a $50 million indictment abroad, and still refuses to step aside? What happens is what we're watching right now. He gets dragged out of the shadows, placed in chains, and readied for a courtroom that won't bend to his bluster. Make no mistake, this capture is not just the fall of one man, it's the fall of an entire illusion. For decades, strongmen in Latin America believed they could survive forever by balancing cartels, oil, and foreign backers. Maduro was their poster child, untouchable, unmovable, unwilling to yield. His fall is the earthquake that sends tremors to every palace and safe safe house from Havana to Managua, and the reaction from his allies, predictable panic. China has already voiced warnings about American integrity in Venezuela.
China's condemning the U.S. And saying, I shouldn't use the word condemn. They're warning us we should look out for the different countries' integrity.
Russia, too, will not sit silently as one of their most reliable partners is stripped from power. But Hegseth's message was defiant. Only Maduro should be worried, not America. And this is where the story gets even darker, because what was once about regime change is now about justice through force. Hegseth himself said it plainly. Regime change is a presidential decision, but the indictment, the bounty, and the mounting evidence left Maduro with nowhere to hide.
Is regime change our goal there?
Well, that's a presidential decision, and we certainly understand the indictment. We understand the $50 million. Anyone would prefer that he would just give himself up.
But Maduro didn't give himself up. He mocked, he lied, he taunted Trump, telling him he was poisoned with lies by his advisors.
Yo le envío un mensaje a usted. No se deje envenenar más contra Venezuela. Lo envenenan todos los días con mentiras.
That arrogance, that refusal to bend, sealed his fate. Because if there's one thing Trump has shown again and again, it's that when you corner him, he doesn't negotiate, he escalates. And now, with Maduro in U.S. custody, extradition is not just imminent, it is inevitable. The trial will expose every detail of cartel ties, every drop of dirty money, and every foreign handshake that kept this narco state afloat. And here's the kicker. This is only the beginning. Because the moment word spread that America's most wanted narco dictator was in chains, the shockwaves began, and they hit harder than anyone expected. The fallout. The moment news broke that Nicolas Maduro had been captured, Venezuela erupted, not in celebration alone, but in chaos, confusion, and raw fear. Crowds surged into the streets of Caracas, some chanting for freedom, others bracing for retaliation. Maduro's arrest was the strike of a hammer against a brittle state, and the cracks were immediate. For years, Venezuelans had been told their leader was invincible. He survived sanctions, economic collapse, and even attempted coups. He was the man who told his people that America would never enslave them, the man who declared that their suffering was the product of foreign lies, and now he was gone, vanished into custody, with his extradition to the United States imminent. The illusion of invincibility shattered in an instant. Inside Venezuela, the regime Maduro built began to cannibalize itself. His allies scrambled to prove their loyalty to the Bolivarian revolution, but the truth was plain. Without their kingpin at the center, the web of corruption and cartel alliances began to fray. Military commanders faced an impossible choice. Do they double down, declaring Maduro a martyr and threatening war with America, or do they quietly prepare to pivot, cutting deals with the very forces they once denounced as imperialist enemies? The public, meanwhile, split in two. For the millions who had fled Venezuela in recent years, forced out by hyperinflation, hunger, and shortages, Maduro's capture was vindication. For those still trapped inside, there was only fear of what came next. Would the regime lash out violently? Would cartels retaliate in the streets? Maduro himself had warned that if Venezuela was touched, the entire continent would rise up in defense.
Y si algún día tocan a Venezuela, toda la América se levantará por nosotros, por el pueblo de Bolívar.
But the crowds filling the avenues of Caracas weren't rising for him. They were rising against him, celebrating the end of a man they saw not as a president, but as a parasite. If the Venezuelan people were stunned, Beijing and Moscow were furious. China, which had invested billions in Venezuelan oil infrastructure, now saw its foothold in Latin America threatened. Maduro had been a critical ally, a voice willing to parrot Beijing's condemnation of U.S. interference. Without him, those investments and that influence looked fragile. Russia, too, relied on Maduro. Caracas was one of Moscow's few steadfast friends in the Western Hemisphere, a government willing to host Russian warships and denounce U.S. sanctions. Putin himself had stood by Maduro during his worst moments. But now, with Maduro in custody, Russia's leverage collapsed, and the warnings had been issued long before the capture. Pete Hegseth acknowledged openly that foreign powers would protest, but he was clear about who should be afraid.
So China and other countries are going to say certain things, and that's their prerogative. What we have there in the Caribbean is a clear demonstration of military might.
Beijing could send parades, Moscow could rattle sabers, but it was Maduro, not America, who had been reduced from head of state to detainee. To understand the fallout, we need to remember how relentlessly Donald Trump pressed the issue. He didn't treat Maduro like a political rival. He treated him like an outlaw. He celebrated the destruction of Venezuelan drug boats, reminding Americans that the narcotics flooding their streets came from Maduro's networks.
They've been sending millions of people into our country, many of them Tren de Aragua, some of the worst gangs, some of the worst people, anywhere in the world in terms of gangs.
In Trump's framing, this wasn't foreign policy. This was self-defense. It wasn't about toppling a regime for ideology's sake. It was about protecting American families from poison, and the message resonated. Communities devastated by fentanyl saw in Maduro not a distant dictator, but a drug lord profiting off their pain. And Trump made no secret of his philosophy: peace through strength.
So, Mr. Secretary, part of the president's philosophy is peace through strength. He wants to be able to have negotiations. He doesn't want to start any new wars.
The capture of Maduro was a perfect embodiment of that creed. America didn't seek war with Venezuela. It sought deterrence through overwhelming force. Even as his power unraveled, Maduro tried to project resistance. He went on state television declaring that the United States could not colonize or enslave Venezuela. He claimed that Washington was preparing a war of lies and manipulation.
Pero por favor, no se dejen meter una mentira más para una guerra más fratricida ahora en Sudamérica y en el Caribe.
But the propaganda lost its force once images of his capture began circulating. Venezuelans who had been told their leader was defending them saw instead a man escorted under guard, powerless, facing extradition. His fiery speeches suddenly sounded like desperate ramblings, the bravado of a man cornered, and the narrative shifted dramatically. For years, Maduro had insisted that Venezuela's suffering was the fault of imperialist sanctions. But with his removal, Venezuelans asked a different question. What if it was the fault of Maduro himself? The capture of Maduro sent shivers through Latin America's other authoritarian leaders. In Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega's regime began purging dissidents with even greater paranoia, fearing that America's gaze might turn his way next. In Cuba, the government issued statements of solidarity with Maduro, but behind closed doors, officials fretted about losing their most critical ally and oil lifeline. Even leaders who had kept some distance from Maduro began recalculating. Brazil and Colombia, both struggling with their own battles against cartels and gangs, now faced a question. Would the U.S. demand the same uncompromising crackdown from them? Maduro's capture didn't just topple one man, it redrew the map of fear in Latin America. Back home, the political reaction was electric. Trump's supporters hailed the capture as proof of his doctrine of strength. Here was a president who promised to protect America and delivered by putting a foreign dictator in chains. His critics, meanwhile, warned that the precedent was dangerous. If the U.S. could seize Maduro, what stopped it from targeting other foreign leaders in the future? But the general public saw something different: justice. For years, communities had been ravaged by the drugs pouring across the southern border, much of it traced back to Venezuela's networks. Trump reminded them of the scale of the crisis.
Last year, under the Biden administration, all 4 years, 100,000 Americans died from drug-related from drugs, from the use of drugs.
Maduro was no abstract dictator. He was a peddler of poison. His capture felt like vengeance for lives lost. Yet amid the celebrations, a darker question lingered. What happens now? Cartels do not forgive easily. Maduro had been their patron, their partner, their shield. His capture left a vacuum, and vacuums breed violence. Hegseth himself warned that the mission would not stop with a single strike.
And it won't stop with just this strike. Anyone else trafficking in those waters who we know is a designated narco-terrorist will face the same fate.
That meant the fight was far from over. Already, whispers spread of retaliation plots, attacks on U.S. assets in the region, escalations at the border, and an increase in drug shipments designed to overwhelm American defenses. The fall of Maduro may have been a victory, but it was also a declaration of war from the cartels who had once relied on him. For Venezuela itself, the fallout was even more complicated. Who would govern now? The opposition, long sidelined and persecuted, suddenly found itself thrust into the spotlight. But could they rebuild a nation gutted by years of corruption and looting? Could they restore faith in democracy after so many fraudulent elections? Or would another strongman simply step into Maduro's shoes, promising reform but delivering the same tyranny? History in Latin America is littered with such cycles, revolutions that replace one dictator with another. What made this moment different was the presence of the United States, not lurking as a distant influence, but actively shaping events. Washington wasn't content to let Venezuela choose its next leader in darkness. By removing Maduro, it forced a reckoning. The world is watching Venezuela not just because of its tragedy, but because of its potential. This is a nation sitting on the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, more than even Saudi Arabia. It is a country whose collapse destabilized an entire region, sending millions of refugees across borders. And now, with Maduro captured, the question is whether Venezuela can finally step out from the shadow of dictatorship and rebuild. build. But the capture also sets a precedent that will reverberate worldwide. If the US can label a foreign leader a narco-terrorist and physically remove him, what does that mean for the global order? What does it mean for the fragile balance of power between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow? For America, this is a triumph. For China and Russia, it is an insult. For the cartels, it is a threat. For the Venezuelan people, it is a chance, a slim, fragile chance at something resembling freedom. But wars demand more than victories. They demand justice. And for Maduro, that justice was about to unfold in the most public, most devastating way possible. The reckoning. The capture of Nicolas Maduro sent shockwaves through Venezuela. The fallout rattled the region and unnerved global powers. But the real reckoning is only beginning, because Maduro is not just captured, he is being extradited to the United States. And when the doors of that courtroom swing open, the entire world will see something unprecedented. A former head of state, a man who once strutted across presidential palaces, standing trial as a narco-terrorist. This is not the trial of a century. It is the trial of a system. The trial of the idea that you can run a country like a cartel, flood the world with poison, rig elections, imprison your opponents, and hide behind sovereignty. That system is about to be dragged into the light. The logistics of extraditing Maduro are delicate, but they are underway. The United States has made it clear that this is not optional. Pete Hegseth himself underscored that the U.S. was prepared with every asset in its arsenal.
But that's a presidential level decision, and we're prepared with every asset that the American military has.
That meant Maduro had no escape, no safe passage to Havana, no asylum in Moscow, no protection from Beijing. For the first time in his political life, he was powerless. His fate was not in his hands, nor in the hands of Venezuelan courts he once controlled. It was in the hands of U.S. Marshals, and as that extradition plane took off, the symbolism was unmistakable. The man who claimed to defend Venezuelan sovereignty was being carried away under guard to face justice in a foreign land. The charges against Maduro are not small. They are not symbolic. They accuse him of directing Venezuela's military and government apparatus to smuggle tons of cocaine into the United States. They accuse him of using state resources to protect and enrich cartels like Tren de Aragua. They accuse him of turning his nation into a launchpad for drugs that killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. But that is only the beginning. Trials are not just about indictments. They are about evidence. And evidence has a way of revealing more than anyone expects. What documents will be unsealed? What wiretaps will be played? What witnesses will testify? Cartel defectors, Venezuelan generals, even former ministers. How many foreign connections will be exposed? Trump himself hinted at the scale of the problem.
I can only say that billions of dollars of drugs are pouring into our country from Venezuela.
Billions, not millions. This was not petty corruption. This was industrial-scale trafficking, sanctioned from the top. And when those billions are traced, who else will be implicated? One of the biggest revelations may involve oil. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, more than even Saudi Arabia. That oil was Maduro's greatest weapon and his greatest vulnerability. He used it to buy loyalty from foreign powers, promising sweetheart deals to China, Russia, and others in exchange for political cover. He used it to finance his government, even as Venezuelans starved, and he used it as leverage, daring the world to sanction him, betting that no one would dare cut off such vast reserves. But the trial may reveal just how deeply those oil revenues were intertwined with criminal networks. How much of that oil wealth was siphoned directly into cartels? How many barrels of crude were traded not for dollars, but for cocaine shipments? If those connections are proven in court, it won't just be Maduro on trial. It will be every foreign power that did business with him, every company that turned a blind eye, every ally that defended him on the world stage. The most chilling part of this reckoning is the cartel question. Maduro did not operate alone. He was part of a vast ecosystem of gangs and narco networks that reached across Latin America. Trump made it plain that these were not just gangs. They were terrorist organizations.
Just this week, I officially designated the drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, including Tren de Aragua and MS-13, which gives us great power.
That designation changes everything. It means the U.S. can pursue them not just as criminals, but as enemies in a war. It means military strikes, drone attacks, and direct action are on the table. And now, with Maduro in custody, the cartels know their shield is gone. The man who once sat in the presidential palace giving them cover is now preparing to face evidence against him. They are exposed, and they are desperate. What lengths will they go to in retaliation? Will they attempt to disrupt the trial? Will they unleash new waves of violence across the region? This reckoning is not just about justice, it is about survival. Even in captivity, Maduro tries to project defiance. He declares that regime change is immoral.
Así que el cambio de régimen, además de ilegal, es inmoral.
He warns that the United States will never enslave Venezuela. He insists he is a victim of lies and imperialist aggression. But those words no longer echo with power. They sound instead like the ramblings of a man stripped of his stage. In the cold light of a U.S. courtroom, rhetoric does not matter. Evidence does. And the evidence is stacking up like mountains. The reckoning is not just Maduro's. It is America's too. For decades, Washington tolerated dictators so long as they provided stability. It looked the other way when regimes turned corrupt, so long as they kept the oil flowing or opposed the right enemies. But the capture and extradition of Maduro signals a new doctrine. The United States will not tolerate narco-states in its hemisphere. It will not allow foreign leaders to flood its streets with poison and hide behind the excuse of sovereignty. This is peace through strength and practice, not endless wars in distant lands, but decisive action against threats close to home. And it is a warning to Ortega in Nicaragua, to Diaz-Canel in Cuba, to every leader in the region who balances on the line between politics and organized crime. The message is simple. Cross that line and you will face the same fate as Nicolas Maduro. For the Venezuelan people, the reckoning is more intimate. This is not just about geopolitics. It is about survival. They have endured hunger, blackouts, mass migration, and repression. They have seen their children die in hospitals without medicine. They have watched their money become worthless in the grip of hyperinflation. For them, Maduro's capture is not abstract. It is personal. It is the possibility, however faint, that the nightmare may finally end. But it is also terrifying, because what comes after Maduro is uncertain. Will the opposition be allowed to govern? Will the cartels unleash chaos? Will foreign powers intervene? For ordinary Venezuelans, the reckoning is both hope and dread, freedom and fear intertwined. When Maduro finally stands before a U.S. judge, the cameras will broadcast history. A dictator, a man who once boasted of sovereignty and defiance, standing as a defendant in chains. The evidence will be damning, the revelations will be explosive, and the consequences will ripple across the globe. But beyond the drama, the trial will ask the most fundamental question. Can justice reach even the highest thrones? Can the world's most corrupt leaders be held accountable, not by coups or assassinations, but by law? If the answer is yes, if Maduro is convicted, sentenced, and stripped of everything he once claimed, then the precedent will echo for decades. Because this is not just about one man. It is about every leader who thinks sovereignty is a shield for crime. It is about every cartel that thinks it can buy protection in presidential palaces. It is about every foreign power that thinks it can use corrupt strongmen as pawns. This is the reckoning, the moment when illusion shatters, when propaganda collapses, when even the untouchable can be touched. And yet, this story is not over, because for every Maduro captured, there are others waiting. For every narco-state dismantled, another rises. The reckoning is not a conclusion, it is a beginning. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, click on one of the boxes playing on your screen to watch more similar content.